If you can do without a team, I think you should. Teams are so difficult to manage. A lot of organizations, I think, are far better off getting people to work together as a working group, meaning that everyone knows what he or she needs to do. The book is called There's an I in Team, principally to try and diffuse a cliche that's been around for a while. And we all know the cliche. The cliche in some ways has already been disbanded by Michael Jordan, the American basketball star. Interesting encounter with Tex Winter, his coach, when he'd been brought in to play fairly late in the game. He did extremely well and was very proud of himself coming off the court. And Tex Winter said, "Well, Michael, you know, there's no I in team." So Michael looked at him and said, "There's an I in win. So which way do you want it?" Okay. And so, because it's probably one of the most popular cliches, what I try to do is to take that one head on and say, well, in fact, the I in team is pretty important. You find that teams are often treated as if they were individuals. You know, they're taken as their own unit of analysis. What people forget is that within teams, even within teams that on the face of it are very effective, are very distinct individuals, people with very different prejudices, loyalties, beliefs, desires, ambitions. And to make a team work well, it's pretty important, for the team's sake, to be very careful to see how people are different within that team and to manage them differently as a result. If you want to try and get people to bond as a team, give them something difficult to do. And that will allow them to hopefully have something to feel good about collectively, and that bonds a team far more than the kind of exercises that we tend to set up for our people. I mean, how many businesses haven't gone astray, having spent, thousands of pounds sending people into the woods or canoeing with some idiot from marketing, or playing games and having as a punishment having colleagues spank other colleagues, with yard signs. I mean, we've got plenty of examples of this, and many of them don't work well. I mean, go online, read the various blogs people have written about the experiences of team building exercises, and they just don't have the effect that's desired. And that's all fueled by an assumption that if we get the team bonding right, we get a team right, and performance will come. I think that's completely wrong. We need to get the performance right, and then people will have a platform on which to bond. Conflicting opinions in teams are very, very important, and it's easy to say that. It's actually very difficult from a management perspective, because it depends a little bit on what you need to get done. Okay, if you have a task that requires people to be creative, conflicting opinions are very, very important. You want people to think differently, to bring different bits of knowledge to the team. That will invariably create tension. And a tension, even if it's healthy tension, is difficult to manage. I mean, the fact that tension is healthy doesn't make it any less awkward. It's still difficult. Okay? If you have a team that needs to do something that is much less creative, where the task is relatively well defined, as is the procedure, then diversity of opinion may not actually be very helpful, because all it will create is aggravation among people in the team. Because after all, the kind of questions you raise really shouldn't be raised. How to solve conflict is a tough one. Here's a nice example. It's an example I'm particularly fond of. It relates to a coach of the Army rowing crew in West Point. These are soldiers rowing. He was faced with a crew that was relatively dysfunctional. How was this expressed? He continued to get emails from members in the crew expressing their unhappiness of the people they were rowing with. They didn't like these people, they didn't trust these people. So he had them line up, and he then had them wrestle each other for 90 seconds at a time. Something they didn't want to do initially, and something that entailed risk. These are strong, big men. They know how to fight, they're here to row. And if they get injured, because that may jeopardize the place in the crew. So he had them fight for 90 seconds at a time, and then he changed the pairs. And after he controlled the pairs, of course, it ended up in a laughing heap. He had them take the boat out for an outing. They had the best ever outing. They packed up the boat, and they had a very big race a few days from that moment, and gave performance that astounded even the best expectations. By having them wrestle each other, for the first time ever, they had a chance to feel physically how strong the various different people in their team were and their crew were. And I think to feel that firsthand through something as high risk as wrestling gave them the kind of confidence they needed to persist, to go back into the boat and row. The problem is, of course, in working life, what's the equivalent of wrestling? But sometimes conflict in teams may simply be due to the fact that I don't really know how good you are. People will self-censor. They will self-censor because they don't like looking stupid. They will self-censor because they prefer to defer to authority, because after all, that means that they don't have to take accountability for whatever decision is being made. Now, in a hospital, that can cause serious difficulties when it comes to patient safety in sports. The consequences are probably not so serious or not as serious. But nonetheless can make people feel quite aggrieved, because people themselves will pay a price for being silent. They'll continue to feel bad about not having spoken up, even if it doesn't involve a life-saving procedure. So long as people have something that's bigger than themselves, they will be okay, because it becomes more important than themselves. For the Cambridge rowers, it's the boat race. The club, the Cambridge University Boat Club, exists for only one reason and has since 1828. It's to beat Oxford in a boat race. Life is simple. Life is simple in a way that it's not for most organizations. So what you give the boys, training to row the boat race, what you give them is something bigger than themselves, something they care about more than themselves, something more important than themselves. And in the Cambridge University Boat Club, we of course have the boat race, meaning we have a very finite end to a team. In most organizations, that's not the case. You've got a senior management team. This can go pretty theoretically almost indefinitely, until they pop off. And, there isn't very much of a rhythm to give their life point or purpose. When you look at teams, even relatively effective teams, you find that boredom can play a real role. And this is not just true of military surgeons. It's true also of people in sports and professional services. I think what's important is to try and distinguish in these environments what kind of boredom we are talking about. Is this the kind of boredom associated with people having nothing to do? And so they become reflective. They just simply don't know what to do with their time, become a bit depressed, have nothing to feel good about. Or is it the kind of boredom that I think is much more common in sports, where so much of what you do is relatively repetitive? Or the boredom you see in many professional service firms is the kind of boredom that arises not from having nothing to do, but from having nothing worthwhile to do. So you can be very, very busy, extremely busy, but yet very, very bored. And a lot of the people that I come in contact with, I think themselves would admit, or have admitted, that actually a lot of what they do, even at a very senior level, is relatively boring. Because, and this is the kind of existential boredom I think is much more prevalent in organizations today and in teams, and that is actually relatively dysfunctional. People, in order to function well, need to have a point. There needs to be a point to what it is they do. There needs to be some meaning to what they do. They need to understand how they themselves fit within not only the team, but within the organization, and why what they do actually matters and who it matters to. And we're not always very good at explaining that to people.